Back to School 2020 Know Your Rights. Brought to you by Every Student Counts Alliance and presented by TeamChild and Northwest Justice Project.
I'm glad that you all can participate, and I'm going to hand it back to Dan to begin the sessions.
We are going to get started with Kim. Thank you, Grace.
All right, everyone. So I am starting off the topic of attendance. So schools are taking attendance right now, and that's whether you're participating remotely or in person or a hybrid version of both. So I just want to discuss like what does taking attendance actually mean right now, and how does that affect truancy since schools, which I'll get to in a moment, can begin to file truancy petitions. So I just want to talk about like how that all looks and how that works. So here's some things that you should know. Schools must take daily attendance for all students, and that's whether participating in a remote or in-person or hybrid version of school. Different schools have different plans of how students will participate. So regardless of the way that students must participate, daily attendance will be taken. Each district has its own policy for taking attendance and what counts as being present. And so that's where things get a little interesting. So what counts as an absence in remote learning was defined in an emergency rule established by OSPI, and that rule says that a remote learning absence is defined as when a student is not participating in planned instructional activities on a scheduled remote learning day. So a lot of people are like, well, what does that even mean? And it can mean so much. So what we know is that more things count right now as excused absences. And the guidance indicates that schools should be more flexible. So that means an excused absence can mean a family member is sick, absences related to students' illnesses, health condition, medical appointments, anything, you know, that's COVID related. An excused absence could be related to parents having to work. It could also be related to a student's own employment or other family obligations that are occurring now during regularly scheduled school hours that are temporarily necessary because of COVID. Until other arrangements can be made. It can include even a student's obligations for babysitting or taking care of younger siblings. It can include a student not having the proper learning materials necessary. So that could mean like lack of necessary instructional tools like internet, broadband access, or connectivity, or stability outages. I mean, I know I've experienced a lot of internet issues, so I'm sure students are experiencing that as well. So all those things apply. Or any other COVID related circumstances that are determined by the school and the parent. So there are a lot of things that can count as an excused absence. Overall, schools get to decide what counts as attendance or participation. So being present in a planned instructional activity can mean a lot of different things as well. It can mean being engaged in an online class. It can mean logging into a student account and working on an assignment. It could mean communicating with a teacher that day, responding to emails, active minutes on Microsoft Teams, submitted completed coursework. It can mean a lot of different things. And OSPI's guidance is pretty broad, and it's pretty broad because it's meant to allow for flexibility, but that just means it leaves a lot for school districts and schools to decide. And so it's really up to the school as to what is counted as being present or participating in a planned instructional activity. And so it's just very important to know what your school district or school's policy really is. And so why does any of this even matter, and why is it important right now? It's really important because schools currently have, as they've been required to take attendance, they've been required to mark all absences this school year as non-truancy remote learning absences. And so that means that any absences students have experienced from the start of this school year up until today, they could not use those absences as a basis of a truancy petition. However, all of this is going to change because that emergency rule actually expires on October 4th. So starting Monday, October 5th, schools will begin to differentiate between an excused and unexcused absence, and they can begin using those absences as a basis to file a truancy petition. So one thing that it is important to note that schools can file truancy petitions, but only if they've tried to contact the family with no response and if there's a safety concern about the student. So reading OSPI's guidance to schools and school districts is basically stating that schools and school districts should be flexible, and the most important thing is that schools are supposed to be trying to figure out if they have any contact with students whatsoever, and if they're having trouble having contact with the student, trying to resolve that issue and figure out what works best for the student and for the family. If that's going to actually play out that way in real life is the big question. And so just to summarize all of this, flexibility around attendance seems to be encouraged by OSPI's guidance, but because it is up to the school district to develop their own policies, it's really, really important to know what your district's policies are. So I've looked at like Central Valley School District's policies compared to Spokane School District's policies, and they're very different. And so it's just very important to know what your district's policies are. And so I'm going to take a pause right here, and I believe Grace has a poll for us.
Yes, so launching the poll on the attendance portion of the session. Question is, have your students been marked absent this year for anything that they should not have been? Okay, we have about 27% of the group saying yes and 73% saying no. I'm going to hand it back over to Kim.
Okay, thank you. So that is really interesting, you know, to know. And I think that's the biggest concern about students being marked absent for something that they should not be marked absent for. And because OSPI has really left the guidance really, really flexible, it creates situations like this, right? Where you're like, well, is that really an absence? Or if a student only participates partially in a day, should that be counted as an absence? And so there's so many questions as to like, are schools really doing things properly? And so I just wanted to go over a few tips of things that you can do around attendance issues. And so, as I've stressed a couple of times, because things really vary between school districts and because OSPI has provided so much flexibilities for schools in their guidance, it's important to find out your district's and your school policy. And I've went on various websites of different school districts to figure out their policies. And as I said before, they're all really different. And so I would really stress going onto your school district website and figuring out your school policy and keeping a copy of that and remembering what that policy states, because that will be very important, especially if you happen to come across a truancy issue. It's important that you let your school know when the student can and cannot attend. I think communication is really important. And I would say communication and documentation. So if you can send that by an email, that would be very important because that's something that you can easily keep record of. But communication is really important, and advocating for an attendance plan that works for the student and the student's family, that's really important. You know, during these times, things are very different for a lot of people. And I think communicating that with the school and letting them know, you know, if a youth does maybe have to babysit every Friday, or they have to take a part-time job because of COVID, but making sure that you advocate for an attendance plan that works for you, and acknowledging that OSPI has provided a lot of flexibility in their guidance, and that is because no family situation is the same. And so really advocating for something that works for the student and for the family. And then lastly, I would say track your students' attendance. Keep a personal written account, text messages, anything, but make sure you keep account of all the participation that a student is doing. So if a student may not be able to be in all of their online classes one day, but they got the assignments or they participated partially, like anything that you can keep track of and keep detail of, it's just really important. Because, you know, flexibility is always nice, but when it is very flexible, it leaves the door open for a lot of interpretation as to, is a student really present or absent? And so I would just encourage that students really keep detailed documentation of what their participation looks like. And I will pass it on to the next topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Go Cougs. That was attendance. Sorry, I'm going into grading. Last semester, as the pandemic started, the state told schools that they could not give F grades, and that if a student didn't meet the criteria for a passing grade, they could give a temporary incomplete grade, but had to give students the opportunity during summer or this school year to bring it up. Thus, no student should have an F grade for the spring 2020 semester. If students do have incomplete grades from last semester, they should be given the opportunity to raise it to a passing grade. Going forward, this state has not extended that requirement into this year. So school districts are left to go back to whatever policy they had before for grading, or make a new policy themselves. The state, however, while saying they weren't going to extend that requirement, did acknowledge that the pandemic has made clear that inequities in traditional grading, there are inequities in traditional grading, and that districts should consider making their grading policies more equitable. They pointed out that extra credit and homework and compliance shouldn't be valued as much in grading as they are, and that there should be multiple opportunities to demonstrate learning, and that learning should be what's reflected in the grading. The direct quote from OSPI Superintendent Chris Reichdahl was, "Now is the time for school leaders and educators to make grades meaningfully aligned to fewer specific standards, combined with feedback that gives students multiple opportunities to demonstrate learning and put homework and extra credit in its proper place. Now is the time to decouple behavior and compliance activities from assessing student learning." So that those were some words, but really not some requirements that the state put on school districts. And as is often the case in our state, some of the first changes happened on the west side with some Seattle area school districts who have taken Fs out of their grading and are carrying forward a new policy that is similar to that of OSPI's during the school closure last spring. As far as I can tell in the Spokane area, no school district has changed their previous school policy. And I know Spokane Public Schools is not at least publicly working on a new one. And this could be an area that people push for change, as the state has directed school districts to consider changing. But at this time, policies are as they were back before the pandemic started. So at this time, we're going to break for a poll question from Grace.
Hi everybody, for the grading portion of the session, the question is, do your students have any grades from last semester they remain concerned about? I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds, so please answer if you'd like to. All right, and here are the results. 33% say yes, and 67% say no. All right, and I'm going to turn it back to Dan.
Everyone for answering that poll question. That is obviously concerning that we have a third of participants here who have students who are still concerned about grades from last semester. The guidance that OSPI gave with respect to this requirement that school districts not give last semester, what isn't very strong as to how to now deal with that. But it does make clear that school districts must give students the opportunity to raise incomplete grades going into this year and all of this year. It doesn't say how they can do that and doesn't establish a formal process for it. But if students do have an incomplete grade still, and the district, the school has not reached out to them on how they can demonstrate their learning in that subject, which is what they need to do to raise it to a passing grade, then they should ask for a meeting with the school. Because as I said, OSPI has said that school districts have to give that opportunity. If there are Fs, again, Fs should not have happened at all. It should have been an incomplete or a passing grade. So that's another opportunity to reach out to your school and say, you see an F on your transcript and it shouldn't be there. And they may say, well, it should have been an incomplete. We put that in there wrong. And in that case, you would still be asking for the opportunity to raise that grade. Now, again, there's no formal process for what that looks like. I believe that TeamChild would be interested in if school districts are not really giving a real opportunity to raise those grades and demonstrate learning as OSPI has directed. And if we would love to hear about issues you're experiencing with trying to raise those grades, as it sounds like there's a pretty substantial portion of you out there who are still struggling with getting schools to bring those grades up. If you disagree with any grade, not just those incompletes or Fs, there's a lot of kind of unknowns as to the grades from last semester. Some of that guidance was also that grades shouldn't have gone down from the beginning of school closures. So if grades went down, that's also something to ask for a meeting to talk with your school about bringing up that grade. In addition to these, with regards to grades from last year, I think that OSPI guidance for school districts to reconsider their policies going forward is an opportunity for folks in the community to raise that need for change and that inequities in current grading policies as they've stood for a long time, that value compliance with one specific way of doing things and value compliance with strict deadlines and value compliance with behavior, that all those things go into grading rather than what OSPI is suggesting, that multiple opportunities of demonstrating actual learning and mastery of a subject is what should be the most valued thing in grading. I think that's an opportunity for folks to tell their districts that they do want change, and I think it's something that we can work on here in Spokane if people are interested. I'm going to finish up grading there, and if we have more questions about it in the question section, I would welcome those then. Thank you. Our next section is special education, and Kathy is going to have that section.
Good afternoon, everyone. So special education is kind of in a bit of flux, as I'm sure you're all aware, but there's still special education requirements still apply even if the student is in remote learning. So the IDEA still applies and none of the requirements have been changed. I know there's a lot of questions about how that is going to happen, but school funding and staffing issues are not a reason to get less in the IEPs. Any less services such as the specially designed instruction, any related services or supplemental aids. The least restrictive environment criteria still applies. There's also the child fine mandate also applies, and they are required to continue to meet the 45-day evaluation process and timeline for identifying a student as a special ed student. And also the 3-year evaluations are not waived. And so those are still required to go forward. What that looks like could be different, but they're still required to go forward. And if there were any missed evaluations during the shutdown, they should be prioritized to get done. So all of those rules still apply. And it's harder to get those services now. So we know that it's frustrating and it's a difficult process right now for parents to get their special education services for their student. But, you know, just like always, keep pushing. Consider any movement, no matter how small, a success. So I've heard a lot of parents say that they can't even get a return email or a return call. If you get that, pat yourself on the back. So take any progress that you can get out of the district as a success. And don't hesitate to go up the chain of command if you're not getting the answers that you need at a lower level, including special ed directors or higher. So just be persistent. Keep advocating for your child. I know it's frustrating, but just keep pushing. The OSPI website also has a lot of information for parents and a lot of support if that would be helpful to you. And I know this says focus on your students' needs, and I'm sure that you are all already doing that. So I just wanted to give you a couple of pointers on how to do that. So for example, you can get recovery services now for students that didn't make any progress last spring. You can also get those recovery services if the school failed to or couldn't provide any IEP services. So those recovery services can look something, you know, like compensatory education. It can be whatever additional services that your student needs to recoup what they've lost. And the way you get those is by requesting an IEP team meeting to be able to have the team decide what services are needed to get those recovery services. And those extra services, if you will, the recovery ones, are oftentimes done outside of the school day, whether it's on a remote or a hybrid model that your student's going to school. There's also the good possibility that your student needs more than what's in the IEP, than what they had going into the COVID times. And so, you know, ask for an IEP meeting and get those additional difficulties that your students having addressed with the school. Perhaps they need, you know, a combination of written materials and online classes if there's no option for in-person, or you would rather not do in-person. Perhaps they need some one-on-one instruction time. You know, start asking for all of those from the district. Related services options too are the telehealth or in-person, depending on where you're at. You have to look at your school policies on the in-person options. But I've seen some related services being offered through telehealth if the student's able to benefit from that. Related services is one that's kind of been up in the air, I think, for a lot of parents on how to get them. And the district cannot have a no in-person policy if that's what the student needs for FAPE. So if you're being told that we just can't do the in-school, but your student is one that cannot get any educational benefit or minimal educational benefit from online classes, then the district's required to meet the FAPE and the free appropriate public education needs for your student. And then we have down here to not agree to reduce or shorten your IEP. And you don't have to agree to amend or reduce your IEP service or any minutes. And, you know, unless it's an initial IEP, the district will do what they want. We all know that. You have to agree to an initial IEP before it can be implemented. But after that, it's the team decision, and the district's required to listen to what you have to say, and then the team will make the decision. So if the team makes a decision against what you want to happen with your child, then make sure you have it noted in the IEP and in the prior written notice what your objections are, and that you objected to whatever it is the school wants to do. And there's been no waiving of your right to challenge any educational services. So if they do what you don't want to happen, there are processes available, an OSPI complaint or a OCR, Office of Civil Rights complaint, if that's appropriate, or due process. So there are ways to challenge that even if they proceed to do what you don't want, but have it noted on the IEP and the prior written notice that you disagree. And there's also been some concern about students being identified as a special ed student simply because they, not simply, but because there was no instruction given to them during a certain time period, and so they've gotten behind. But they are really for students with disabilities. And so special ed services should be focused on those students, not ones that are behind because of the lack in services for COVID that do not have disabilities. And ensure that any changes that are made with the entire IEP team. And I've seen a lot of ones where they just drop off those virtual meetings. And so make sure you're asking, you know, who's leaving, why they're leaving, and the district is still supposed to get your consent before a team meeting leaves, and you have the right to ask that the meeting be rescheduled if a team member you want to remain has to leave. There's also the option to do addendums by without having a meeting. And, you know, if you're comfortable with that, that's fine, but you don't have to do that. You can request an IEP meeting for any addendum. So it's just whichever process that you are most comfortable with to be able to advocate for your student. And so I think now Grace will have some questions for you.
Hi everybody, so for the special education section, we actually have 2 polls. The first is just to kind of get an idea of everybody in the session. So how is the student attending class this school year? Virtually, in a hybrid format. I think it's supposed to be virtually, in person, or in a hybrid format. So if your student is in person, please select the second option. All right, and I will close the poll in about 10 seconds. So here are the results of people in the session today. 44% have their students virtually, just virtually, and 56 have a combination of both. And then our second poll for today is about IEPs. Have you ever had an IEP meeting yet this year, and has the school requested any COVID-related amendments? Yes, and I have concerns about possible amendments. Yes, and I was confident in how it went. No, or not applicable. All right, I'll be ending the polling now. Everybody can see how the meetings have gone so far. And I'll hand it back to the next presenter.
Thanks, Grace. So that's a little concerning that a quarter of you have concerns about the IEP process and how it went. So I'm going to put a little plug in here for Northwest Justice Project, if I may. We are doing a special ed clinic every Tuesday from noon to 2 and every Thursday from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. And I think the information is in the Every Student Counts email strings, but you call a specific number. And I'm sorry, I don't have that handy right now, but you call that number and they do an intake, and then you get assigned one of those sessions to meet with an attorney to talk about your child's education for an hour. So feel free to call. There is income requirements as well, so, but they'll figure that out at the screening. So what do you do for special education? You document, document, document. You've already been told a couple of times today to document, but that really is what's going to need to happen. So document all your contacts with the school district, the teachers, the parents. You know, if you have a little notebook, keep it handy just to write it down. If you have a phone where you can write your notes in, that is really the most important thing. Keep track of how your students doing, keep all your emails, keep all your texts. If there's any successes or difficulties that your student's having, keep them there written down. What works, what doesn't. If your student was supposed to be getting 45 minutes a week of speech and language, and he's only getting 15 minutes a week by virtual, then that's a half an hour a week that he's losing. But keep it documented on what your student is getting and what he's not getting that is in the IEP. It's also, from a legal perspective, it's much more credible and reliable if you make those notes closest as you can to the time something happened. So keep that in mind when you're making these notes. So if you try to figure out what happened for the last month, it's not going to carry as much credibility if there's any legal arguments that you're able to make in the future. Also, IEP meetings, most of them now are virtual, as I talked a little bit about, and so, request them. They're holding them. They are, if you need an in-person one for you to participate, then ask for that. Some of the schools are now doing some in-person classes, so they do have the COVID protections in place. And as long as you do, then do the in-person meetings and request them. But make sure that you participate in the IEP meetings. And then, the temporary changes in IEPs are something that I've been seeing that are being done sometimes with and without parent consent or even knowledge. So pay attention to any temporary changes that you're seeing in the IEPs. And if it is a temporary change and there's a time frame identified to that, then make sure that whatever that time frame is, that you're following up to make sure the next step is in place before that time expires. And if you, as I said earlier, if you disagree with anything that's done with the IEP, then make sure your objections are noted in the IEP or the prior written notice. If the temporary plan's not working, then request an IEP meeting. If sometimes the accommodations are difficult to do in a virtual setting, so, make a note if there's been any changes on what your student will get by accommodations on a temporary basis. and make sure they're not lost when we do end up back in school, because I'm pretty sure we will at some point. So make sure that your student's not losing anything. Same with technology. There are actually some accommodations and technology that may be helpful. So there are temporary changes that, that are designed to help your student be more successful in the virtual setting. So if you need any of those, then, ask for the IEP meeting and get those changes made. I think that's it.
Thanks, Kathy. All right, we've got tech access and support from Jim next.
Thanks, Dan. Well, today I'm going to be talking about technology, which has become a very vital part of our learning, especially during the age of COVID, and seeing even the results of the poll in the last segment. It looks like most students are in either a virtual or a hybrid learning environment. So as schools do more online learning, it's important, and what I'm going to be talking about today is that both students and their families, they need both access and training. So if we go on the what to know slide here, which we'll start with the first point on your screen there. If your school is using online education, they must help you get equipment and internet. Schools need to ensure each student can use their platforms and programming and giving you equipment like laptops or tablets and helping you get internet access. And also the second point here is that the school must also train their staff, students, and family on this technology. So you're aware of how the system works, and you want to make sure that any online class can meet your student's level. If your school is using online education, then you want to call your school to make sure you have all the equipment and get all the help that you need on how to use it. The third point here is some internet and wireless providers, including there's a few listed there: AT&T, Comcast, T-Mobile. They're offering free wireless or hotspots for existing customers. Many internet providers are continuing to help people get connected. Some of them are even offering free Wi-Fi, or they have some kind of deals for existing customers, and even some wireless providers even offering some unlimited smartphone data. So you want to contact your internet or wireless provider to get more information on that. The fourth point here talks about Wi-Fi access by Spokane Public Schools. They're offering essentially parking lot Wi-Fi hotspots. While I'm talking, I think it would be good if you need this information to at least take a picture on your phone of the list there. There are many different parking lots at different schools available listed there. There's a username and passcode information, and there's also a website. So feel free to take a snapshot on your phone of that if you need that information. And you can also go to the website listed there on your screen. So now I'm going to pause here and turn it to Grace.
Hi everybody, these poll questions are again a survey about your students' experiences. So the first question is, do you have a computer or laptop at home for each student to use for attending online school? Yes or no? All right, I'm going to end the poll and we can see the results. So it looks like 100% of people who answered said that each student has their own device. Second poll question, do you have working internet at home for each student to get connected to their online school platforms? And I'll be closing the poll in about 10 seconds, so if you'd like to answer, please get your answer in. And it looks like 86% of people have working internet at home for each student, and 14% do not.
Thank you, Grace. I think those are some good results. It shows that a lot of people have access to at least a computer, and internet can be an issue. So I think it's important to at least plan for, well, if your computer breaks or if you do have internet problems, you want to at least, like it says, call your school to get what you need to access online classes. From the poll results, it looks like everyone has a laptop, but let's say you are a klutz and you break it or something happens to it, you do want to call Spokane Public Schools. They have a laptop checkout form on their website that's listed there. That shows that website, as it states there, all students are assigned their own laptop under the student laptop take-home program. And the parent or guardian can fill out a laptop checkout form on their website. For those of you that don't have internet, contact your school and see how you can best get that laptop checkout form so you can get one. Again, as it states down there, the bottom, check with your provider to see if they offer free internet. There are ways to get free internet as well. For example, if your student qualifies for free or reduced price meals, that the Spokane Public Schools may provide a Comcast Internet Essentials activation code or a hotspot for you. So if for those of you that are having issues with internet, you definitely do want to contact the school and see if you can get a hotspot or a code or something. The one thing I will add as well is that the state of Washington has drive-in hotspots for emergency internet access. So to find a hotspot closest to you, you can contact the Washington State Department of Commerce. They do have an office in Spokane, and you can find them on their website, or the number is 509-720-9656. They're open Monday through Friday from 8 to 5. They're on 10 Post Street on the 4th floor in Spokane. So there are many ways to get connected if you do have a laptop but you're having internet issues. So, make sure you take advantage of a lot of the resources available that can help with that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. All right, I'm gonna be doing discipline, and I'm gonna go through it really fast because nothing has really changed, but I wanna go through one functional difference. So discipline is still the same and has been the same since the beginning of the pandemic. There have not been any different rules instructed by OSPI. Most discipline from last school year, while schools were still open, should have ended unless an expulsion from early last semester or an expulsion was formally extended, because expulsions are the longest out of school discipline that can be given in Washington, and they are only for the length of an academic term. So at this point, that would be 90 days in Spokane Public Schools, and that would be ending pretty soon if it had been given shortly before schools closed in March. But even then, I think standard thought is that with all that is going on and the incredible inaccess to education right now, schools shouldn't be extending out of school discipline. For all school discipline, you are supposed to get notice, and you should be informed of why there's discipline and what it's going to be. You have the opportunity to be heard about what the school is alleging and your side of things, as well as the big important part is that even during expulsion or suspension, school districts are responsible for educating students and providing educational services. And that was true even before distance learning. So during expulsions or suspensions from in-person school, districts would often provide virtual learning as those educational services. So the big thing at this point is if school districts were going to suspend or expel from virtual learning, what are they going to do to provide those educational services? I don't know what's really less than the virtual learning. So we haven't heard about really out of school suspensions or expulsions during distance learning, and if there are instances of it, we would like to know, because there's really nowhere to go lower than the distance learning being provided. Grace, do we have a poll question?
I do. The poll question for discipline is, have you faced issues with any sort of classroom discipline this school year? Yes, full classroom exclusion. Yes, other discipline, or no. And for the sake of time, I will be wrapping up this poll in about 10 seconds. Thank you to everybody who answered, and here are the results. 29% of people in the session, students, have experienced other discipline, with 70% experiencing no discipline. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you for answering that. And if people are willing to share during the questions portion, would love to hear what sort of discipline issues people are facing. But I'm glad to hear that at least among this group, there haven't been any complete classroom exclusions. So on what to do with discipline, it's basically just the same as always. Make sure that they give you notice, including what they allege, what the discipline is going to be, and make sure that you have your chance to challenge it, whether it be just an informal meeting with a principal or the formal discipline procedures, which would be a whole nother training, but would include saying that you want an appeal in writing. And again, the big part is that making sure that your student is getting educational services if they were to be excluded from the classroom. But the big thing is also just please let us know if there are attempts at out of school exclusion right now, because it's common thought that that shouldn't be happening right now. And we would like to know where it is and how to help and challenge that. So we will be finishing up with homeless rights from Rosie.
Hi, everybody. The idea of homeless rights kind of comes to us from federal legislation through the McKinney-Vento Act, so you may have heard of that before. And then in 2016, the state of Washington, in the effort to close the educational opportunity gap, also added some increased services and programs to homeless education. So basically, what is homeless education, I think, is a good thing to ask. I mean, it's not just being like living on the street. It also means things like shared housing. A family's had to move in with a grandparent or an aunt, an uncle, family, friends, any of that. A person who's living in a hotel, a motel, a trailer park, a camper, emergency or transitional shelters, abandoned youth who are just like left at a hospital or left somewhere else. Living on the street, of course, is definitely one. Living in a car is homeless. Living on a park bench, a bus station. And if a child is migratory, moving from one place to the other, they fall under the statutory definition of homelessness, or McKinney-Vento. So they have the basic thing is that homeless students have the same right to education that every other student has. And the idea is that those rights will be made available, will become meaningful to them through help from the school. So if a student wants to attend the school where they became homeless and continue out, that year or the next year, they can do that. If the student has the right also to all programs and activities that the school receives. So that could mean things like playing football or basketball, and it could be being part of drama. It could be anything that a school does, as well as educational opportunities within the school. Anything any other student could do, a homeless student should be made available to them. Homeless students do not have to prove residency. In some of the districts around here, in particular, I know Central Valley and maybe Meade, they require a parent to bring in a bill, either a lease or some sort of bill that shows that they've got utilities in the district. A homeless parent does not need to prove that they're living in their car or wherever they're living. They say they're homeless and they can do that. The other thing they have the right to that's really important is that the student can start school immediately. They do not have to wait for their immunization record to get there. They do not have to wait for their IEP records or special education records or 504 plan or whatever other record they have. If they don't have a transcript, that's fine. They still get to start school. So those are really big, important rights, because those are things that sometimes are very hard for homeless people to have. Grace, I think we had a question too, didn't we?
Yes, so we have our poll question. Do you know students or families that are homeless and have barriers to accessing their schools and classes? And here are the results. Yes, about a third have no students or families that are homeless. And we have one more quick poll question for this section. Do you know students or families that are homeless and are not enrolled or not able to enroll in school? So despite the 1/3 of us knowing students or families that are homeless, 100% of them are able to enroll in school.
It's fabulous. That's good that everybody's being able to enroll. There was a time where that was kind of a challenge in some school districts. And I think with COVID, what we're going to see, of course, or what we're all fearful of, is that we're going to see a lot more people without housing, or, with substandard housing. So I think we're all kind of worried about that coming up. The biggest thing that you could do to help somebody else who's homeless that you learn about is to find out who the HEART liaison is in the school. And I say HEART because everybody around this district in Spokane uses that word for homelessness. So the liaison person through McKinney-Vento is always known as the HEART person. Every district has to have one. So that person is specially trained to know all the laws regarding McKinney-Vento and what the offerings could be for schools. If there's any question, OSPI has a website with every single district and every single district's homeless liaison on it. So one of the big things for students that are homeless has to be to sign up for breakfast and lunch. That's at no cost. So I know because we've represented some foster youth, sometimes that's been hard, because I would go to enroll a student or help a student enroll, and that they would, oh, well, we can't get you the thing for, especially in high schools, they have to have a code. So it's really important that you could know that they can do it right away, and that they should contact that school HEART person the first day. And often everybody in schools don't know what the requirements of McKinney-Vento are, or HEART, but that HEART coordinator does, and they're pretty responsive and really welcome the questions. And then again, anything a student needs to do to be successful in school, they can get. Literally, they should be able to ask for almost anything the school could offer. So school supplies should not be a problem. If it's paper, if it's pencils, if it's a backpack that they need, if it is a calculator for higher math, if it is the transportation to get to and from school, or to get to the old school from where they're living now, that's something that can be provided for them. If they want to play football and they need equipment to do it, if they want to be in band and need, especially in, I think, like the Meade district, the band is really huge and they're fairly costly. So that's something that the McKinney-Vento Act says that they have to make available to students to do. So anything that that student wants to do in school should be provided. An ASB card, being able to go to football games or basketball. And although we're not having those right now, if there is something that's available, they still could do that. And in the future, they're going to be able to do that. So these are really important rights. If you have a student that doesn't have a parent too, they still get to do all these things. They don't have a parent and they're living with another family and that family doesn't have any custody of them. These are still rights that will apply to that student. So they're really important rights. They're not all just COVID things, but unfortunately, I think we're going to see more families falling into that. Last year, 2017, 2018 was the highest year for Washington having homeless students. So it's not a good trend, unfortunately. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, everybody. Before we get to some questions, I just want to point out some resources on TeamChild's website. There is a written manual with some of the same information, but also some more in-depth information on these same topics and some more topics. And there's also a manual that we've had around for a while that is not just COVID rights, but also just general education rights and special education rights in Washington. And then Kathy, here's the information about your clinics. Would you like to say anything more about them?
Just that I encourage anyone to call and sign up and get on the list. They are, so far we've gotten some pretty good feedback from parents on the advice that they're given, so give it a try.
All right. Grace, are there questions that have come in through chat?
Yes, just a reminder to everybody, if you do have questions, you can send them to Grace Nguyen in the Zoom chat. Our first question is on attendance. The question is, how should we react or advocate for our students when teachers threaten to mark students as absent when students do not respond or have cameras off or have login issues, etc.?
I would say repeating what a lot of us had said today is document, 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 and document it that day. Like Kathy mentioned, it's so much easier if you document it that day than like 2 months later trying to go back. Like even as Kathy mentioned, it holds so much more weight with credibility, you know, if you're keeping a log. But that is kind of like the struggle that we're in, because things are flexible, because guidance that was provided to schools is so flexible. You know, schools have a large range of things that they can do. And so I've even went through, you know, the OSPI guidance, and it's like, are schools allowed to do that? Technically they can, if that's their policy. Schools can determine, some schools can, you know, mark tardies if you're 10 minutes late, and some have decided that they're not going to do that. And so I think the important thing is to document everything that's happening, because you want to be able to show how your student is participating.
For more questions or assistance, please contact TeamChild or Northwest Justice Project. Thank you for joining us today.